I took in a homeless boy, fed him, and gave him a home. Then he told me something that made me a millionaire. I never thought my life would take such a turn. I was just a regular guy, 41 years old, living in a quiet little town with my wife. We rented a modest apartment, nothing fancy, just enough to call home. Our place had that classic old carpet smell and a faucet that made a weird noise every time you turn on too fast. But it was ours, and we made it work. I ran a small auto repair shop, something I inherited in spirit from my grandfather, who taught me everything about cars. Not just any cars, classic ones, the kind with history, with soul. While other kids were playing video games, I was in his garage, covered in grease, listening to him ramble about how real cars had personalities. Business was steady, nothing that would make me rich, but it kept the lights on and put food on the table. It was honest work, the kind that made your back ache, but also made you proud. My customers were mostly the same folks who'd been around forever, guys with trucks that had more rust than paint, and ladies who swore their old Buicks had just stopped working out of nowhere. My wife and I had been together for years. She was my rock, my best friend, but there was always this void between us, something neither of us could change. We couldn't have kids. Doctor confirmed it, and no miracle ever came our way. We had started talking about adoption, but the whole process seemed overwhelming, expensive, complicated, full of waiting and hoping. It felt like a mountain too high to climb, so we just kept pushing the conversation to some distant later. One night, after an exhausting day at the shop, I was walking home, smelling like motor oil and bad coffee, when I spotted a kid digging through a dumpster behind a convenience store. He couldn't have been more than 10, maybe 11. His clothes were dirty, and his hair was matted. He looked up at me, startled, ready to run. I raised my hand slightly, trying to show I wasn't a threat. "Whoa! Kid, I'm not the cops," I said, realizing how rough I probably looked after a long day of fixing engines. He hesitated, then mumbled that he hadn't eaten in 2 days. That hit me like a punch to the gut. A kid, alone, hungry. That wasn't something I could just walk past. I took him to a nearby diner, the kind with sticky booths and waitresses who call you Han. The smell of fresh fries and grilled burgers must have been heaven to him. He inhaled his food like he hadn't seen a meal in weeks, barely stopping to breathe between bites. Between mouthfuls, he told me his story. A year ago, he had everything: a mom, a dad, a home. Then, one tragic night, it was all gone. A car accident took his parents, leaving him alone in the world. His relatives didn't want to take him in, so he ended up in foster care. It wasn't the kind of place they show in brochures. Older kids bullied him, and the adults barely paid attention. So, a few months ago, he ran. Now, he slept in an abandoned house on the edge of town, avoiding shelters and anyone who might send him back. He had no plan, just survival. He looked up at me, half expecting me to lecture him or tell him he had to go back. But I didn't. Then he mentioned something that made my heart clench. His grandfather had collected model cars, rare ones, classics. He used to sit with him, talking about how every car had a story, a soul. Every birthday, every Christmas, his grandpa would give him a new model car, telling him a little history about it. He had a whole collection. Tiny Mustangs, Corvettes, Chevelles, each one a piece of a story his grandpa wanted him to carry on. But when everything fell apart, those models were lost too. Still, he never stopped loving old cars. Something in me shifted. I felt it in my chest. This kid, against all odds, still cared about something, still found joy in the same thing I did. When he finished eating, he sat back with a satisfied sigh, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand like he'd just had the best meal of his life. "Man," he said, "that was way better than gas station sandwiches." I chuckled. "That's not a high bar, kid. What's your name, anyway?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Jake." "All right, Jake. You got a last name?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." That hit harder than I expected. He grinned, but then his face got serious. He thanked me, said I was nice, but he had to go. It was getting late, and he had to get back to his home. My gut told me let him walk out of that diner was the wrong move. But what could I do? I wasn't his dad. I wasn't anyone to him. Jake didn't have a home. He had nowhere to go, no family waiting for him. He had run away from a shelter, and the thought of him spending another night alone in some abandoned house made my stomach turn. It just felt like the right thing to do. So, before I could overthink it, I told him he could crash at my place for the night, get cleaned up, eat something real. My wife would understand. She always did. Jake hesitated. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to decide if I was one of the good guys or just another adult making promises he couldn't keep. But hunger and exhaustion won out, and he finally gave me a slow nod. We walked through town, the streets mostly empty except for the occasional passing car. The neon sign from the corner diner flickered, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. When we got to my place, I could already hear my wife moving around inside, probably putting away dishes or folding laundry. The second I opened the door, she turned, her eyes landing on Jake. Her face went from curiosity to concern in half a second. She didn't ask who he was. She asked why he looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks and why his clothes were practically falling apart. That's my wife for you. Straight to the important stuff. I told her everything. The dumpster, the shelter, the abandoned house. Her expression softened, and she gave Jake one of those looks only a good person can give, like she saw more than just some homeless kid in front of her. Without another word, she disappeared down the hall. A minute later, I heard the sound of running water. "Bath's ready," she said over her shoulder, already gathering some fresh clothes from the closet. Jake shifted awkwardly, clearly not used to this kind of attention. He mumbled something about not wanting to be a bother, but my wife wasn't hearing it. She just pointed toward the bathroom and told him he wasn't stepping foot in her kitchen until he was clean. I expected him to argue, but he just nodded and disappeared down the hall. The door shut, and a moment later, we heard the pipes groan as the water filled the tub. My wife turned back to me, crossing her arms. "What's the plan here?" she asked, keeping her voice low. I didn't have a good answer. All I knew was that I couldn't just let the kid go back to the streets. "He can stay for a night," I said. "We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." She didn't argue. Instead, she sighed and went back to the kitchen, pulling out whatever leftovers she could throw together into something that felt like a home-cooked meal. She reheated some roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and made a quick grilled cheese, saying, "Every kid loves grilled cheese. It's science." By the time Jake came out of the bathroom, wearing one of my old shirts that practically swallowed him whole, the table was set and the smell of warm food filled the air. His hair was damp, and for the first time, he looked like a normal kid, not some street-hardened runaway. He sat down hesitantly, still looking like he expected someone to tell him he wasn't supposed to be there. But as soon as he took that first bite, I saw the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. Over dinner, he started talking more. Maybe it was the food. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time in a long time, someone was actually listening. He told us about his parents, about how good things used to be. He used to love drawing, but ever since he ran away, he hadn't picked up a pencil. He mentioned his only remaining relatives, some distant family members who hadn't wanted him after his parents passed. They had dumped him in shelter and never looked back. He said it like it didn't bother him, but I wasn't buying it. At one point, he stopped eating, his fork hovering over his plate. He looked between my wife and me, hesitant, like he didn't know if he should say what was on his mind. "I don't want to be a problem," he finally said. "I can leave tomorrow. Thank you for this." I didn't like the way he said it, like he was already preparing to disappear. I told him he could stay as long as he needed to. We'd figure things out together. My wife nodded in agreement, and for the first time that night, I saw something shift in Jake's eyes. Hope, or at least the beginning of it. After dinner, my wife set up the couch for him with fresh blankets, fussing over whether he needed an extra pillow. Jake sat there, looking around like he wasn't sure if he was dreaming. Before heading to bed, I caught him staring at the framed picture on the wall. My grandfather, standing next to a beat-up old Camaro, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "That your car?" Jake asked, nodding at the picture. I said, "first one I ever fixed up." Jake just nodded, staring at it a little longer before mumbling goodnight. I watched as he lay down, pulling the blanket over himself, his small frame barely making a dent in the couch cushions. He didn't say anything, but the way he nodded told me he wasn't planning on running out the door just yet, and that felt like a good start. A few weeks had passed, and Jake was still with us. At first, I thought he'd leave after a couple of nights, but something shifted. He fit right in, like he'd always been here. It wasn't just that he had a place to sleep or food on the table. It was more than that. My wife and I had been living in this quiet little rhythm for years, and suddenly, there was this kid in the mix, shaking things up in the best way possible. He was a good kid. No attitude, no trouble. If anything, he tried too hard to pull his weight. Every morning, before I even had my first cup of coffee, he was already helping my wife in the kitchen. She'd tell him to relax, but he'd just shrug and keep going, drying dishes, setting the table, even sweeping the floor without being asked. It wasn't normal 10-year-old behavior, and that's what got to me. This kid had spent so much time looking out for himself that he didn't know how to just be a kid anymore. At first, I worried he might feel out of place, like he was just a guest overstaying his welcome, but that wasn't the case. He found routine with us, and honestly, the house felt different. It wasn't just me and my wife sitting in front of the TV at night, barely talking after a long day. Now, there was a third voice in the mix, one that never ran out of things to say. Jake had this way of making even the simplest things interesting. He'd ask the most random questions, like why peanut butter and jelly were considered a perfect combo, or why my old truck made a weird noise when it hit 50 miles per hour. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find them both covered in flour. My wife was laughing, trying to wipe her face with the back of her hand, which only made things worse. The counter was a mess, sugar, butter, bits of dough everywhere. And right in the middle of it was Jake, grinning like a kid who just won the lottery, holding a rolling pin like it was some kind of trophy. They were baking a pie. I leaned against the doorway, watching as Jake carefully pressed the crust into the pan. He was concentrating so hard, his tongue sticking out just a little. He told my wife that he used to bake with his mom all the time. Every Sunday, they'd make something special for his dad. Apple pie, peach cobbler, brownies. He said his mom always let him do the important parts, like measuring the sugar or mixing the filling. His dad would come into the kitchen, pretending not to notice the mess, and act surprised when dessert magically appeared on the table. Hearing that hit different. I'd never seen Jake talk about his parents like that before, like they were still here, like he could almost reach out and touch those memories. My wife must have felt it too, because she got real quiet, just nodding along as she helped him crimp the edges of the crust. When the pie went into the oven, Jake turned to grab a towel and wiped his hands. He was talking to my wife about something, some story about how his mom used to let him lick the spoon. When it happened, just like that, without thinking, he called her mom. The second the word slipped out, he froze. My wife's eyes went wide, and for a split second, I saw the exact moment it registered. Then her face crumpled, and before Jake could even start apologizing, she pulled him into the biggest hug I'd ever seen. Her hands shook as she held him, and I saw the tears slip down her face. Jake stiffened for half a second, like he wasn't sure if he should let it happen. Then he just melted into her arms. She whispered something to him. I couldn't hear what, but whatever it was, it made him squeeze her even tighter. When she pulled back, she wiped her face and smiled, telling him that she'd do everything in her power to make sure he never forgot what it felt like to be loved. Later that night, after the pie had been devoured, because of course it was amazing, Jake and my wife sat curled up on the couch, flipping through an old recipe book she had pulled from the shelf. He was pointing at different desserts, asking which ones were her favorites, and she was telling him stories about the ones she used to make with her grandmother. I stood in the doorway, watching them, sipping my coffee, and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. It hit me then how much things had changed in such a short amount of time. My wife looked different, happier, lighter. She had always carried this quiet sadness, this unspoken weight of knowing we'd never have kids of our own. But with Jake here, it was like she had permission to be the mother she had always wanted to be. Standing there, watching them, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I woke up with one thing on my mind. I had to make this official. Seeing Jake with my wife the night before, watching the way he fit into our lives like he was always meant to be there, I couldn't ignore it. I had no idea what I was doing, but that had never stopped me before. So, after a quick breakfast, I made up some excuse about errands and drove straight to the shelter Jake had run from. It wasn't hard to find. The place looked exactly like you'd expect. Gray brick, a chain-link fence, a sad-looking playground with a broken swing. Walking through those doors felt heavier than I expected. The lady at the front desk gave me that look, the one that said she'd seen too many kids come and go. I asked about Jake, told her I wanted to start the adoption process. She barely reacted, just sighed, and handed me a stack of papers thick enough to stop a bullet. The process was going to be long, complicated, and full of red tape, but I wasn't walking out of there without starting it. When I got home, Jake was on the couch, flipping through one of those old car magazines I had lying around. My wife was in the kitchen, humming to herself. It felt normal, like a family. I sat down across from him, the adoption form still in my hands. I told him everything, where I'd been, what I was doing. Then I asked him, straight up, if he wanted to stay with us. For good. Be a family. For the first time since I met him, Jake looked scared. Not the kind of fear he had when he was living on the streets, but the kind that came from hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't too good to be true. He hesitated, then asked the one question that had probably been sitting in his head for years. Are you going to leave me too? My wife didn't even let me answer first. She sat beside him, took his hand, and told him that no matter what happened, he wasn't going anywhere, that we weren't like the people who had let him down before, that he was ours and we were his. No conditions, no second thoughts. I saw it in his face, the moment it finally clicked, the moment he let himself believe it. He nodded, not trusting his own voice, and just like that, it was decided. The next few months were a nightmare of paperwork, home visits, interviews, and hoops to jump through. Every step of the process made me want to rip my hair out. But every time I looked at Jake, I knew it was worth it. Somewhere in the middle of it all, we found our rhythm. Jake had chores now. Nothing crazy. Just little things like feeding the dog, taking out the trash, setting the table. He never complained. In fact, he seemed to like having responsibilities, like it made him feel like he belonged. One day, I caught him in the garage, running his fingers over the hood of an old Mustang I'd been working on. He looked up at me and asked if I'd ever teach him how to fix cars. The kid had spent so long trying to survive, he never had the chance to just learn something for fun. I told him he could start by handing me a wrench. His face lit up like I just handed him the keys to a Ferrari. The day became official. We didn't do anything fancy. No big parties, no speeches. Just the three of us, sitting at the dinner table, eating my wife's famous pot roast. Jake didn't say much at first, just poked at his food like he was still processing everything. Then out of nowhere, he looked up, grinned, and said, "So, does this mean I officially get my own spot in the family group chat?" My wife nearly choked on her drink. I laughed so hard I had to set my fork down. That night, something changed. It wasn't just the paperwork that made it real. It was the way Jake let himself relax, really relax for first time, like he finally believed this was permanent. Life after that was better than I ever could have imagined. My wife threw herself into being a mom, and Jake soaked up every bit of it. She helped with his homework, packed him lunches, and made sure he always had what he needed. The kid thrived. We got him into school, and within a few months, his teachers were already singing his praises. They told us he was bright, quick to catch on, and eager to learn. One of them even pulled me aside one day and said, "You've got a special kid. He's got a future." Hearing that, that was it for me. That was the moment I knew we hadn't just saved Jake. He had saved us too. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had done something truly right. It had been a good morning. The kind that made me appreciate how much my life had changed in the past few months. My wife and Jake had spent the morning baking, and when they walked into my shop just before lunch, they were carrying a still warm pie, the smell of cinnamon and sugar filling the air. I wiped my hands on a rag and leaned against the workbench as my wife set the pie down on a stack of old car manuals. Jake was already wandering around. I scanned the walls where I had pinned up posters of classic cars, Mustangs, Corvettes, a few vintage race cars. He had always loved looking at them, but today, something caught his eye. He stopped in front of a poster, tilting his head like he was trying to remember something. It was an old print of a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, one of the most legendary and valuable cars ever made. I glanced over and saw the way he was staring at it. I asked if he had ever owned a model of it in his old collection. He shook his head but said something that made me pause. He had seen a car like that before. Not in a magazine. Not on TV. In real life, I put my fork down. He explained that back when he was living on the streets, there was an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, deep in the woods. Sometimes he stayed there when he had nowhere else to go. Behind that house, about 100 meters into the trees, there was a clearing with an old, wrecked car buried in the brush and covered in moss. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, looking at the poster, he realized it looked a lot like the Ferrari in the picture. My heart started pounding. Finding an old car rusting away in the woods wasn't unheard of. I'd seen plenty of abandoned wrecks in my time, but a Ferrari 250 GTO? That was different. Even in terrible condition, one of those could be worth a fortune. I tried not to get ahead of myself, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. The next morning, Jake and I loaded up my truck and headed out at sunrise. The town was still waking up as we drove toward the edge of the city, past old farms and winding roads that barely showed up on GPS. Jake directed me to the abandoned house he had mentioned. It was exactly what I expected. Half-collapsed roof, vines creeping up the sides, broken windows. The kind of place you'd see in a horror movie. This is where you used to sleep? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake just nodded, like it was no big deal. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't push. We had something else to focus on now. We walked behind the house, past overgrown bushes and trees that had probably been untouched for decades. The deeper we went, the quieter it got, like the world had pressed a mute button. After about 10 minutes, the ground turned soft beneath our feet. Jake pointed ahead. There, he said. At first, I didn't see anything. Just more trees, some fallen branches, and a patch of muddy ground. But then I spotted it. A curve of metal, barely visible under layers of moss and dirt. A shape too smooth, too perfect to be just another forgotten junker. I stepped closer, my boot sinking slightly into the damp earth. My breath caught when I saw the emblem, still visible through the grime. A prancing horse. Ferrari. It was real, and it was here. I knelt down, running my hand over the metal. The car was partially sunken into the earth, like it had been sitting there for decades. The windows were long gone. The tires had rotted away, and the once bright red paint was almost completely swallowed by nature. But there was no mistaking it. This was a Ferrari 250 GTO. If this was what I thought it was, even in its current state, it could be worth more money than I had ever seen in my life. Jake stood beside me, kicking at the mud with his sneaker. So what do we do now? I let out a slow breath. My mind was already racing with possibilities. If I could get this thing out of here, if I could restore it, even just partially, it would be the biggest project of my life. I turned to Jake, my heart pounding. We just found something incredible. The second we got back to town, I made a call. My buddy might own a towing company, and if there was one guy who wouldn't ask too many questions, it was him. When I told him I needed a flatbed with a winch, he just whistled and asked, "What kind of trouble did you get yourself into this time?" An hour later, Jake and I were bouncing down that same old road, the tow truck rattling as we drove back toward the woods. The whole way there, my heart was racing. If this car was what I thought it was, we weren't just hauling out an old wreck. We were pulling history out of the mud. Getting it out, though, wasn't easy. The thing had been sitting there for decades, half buried in swampy earth, tangled in roots and vines. It took us a solid 2 hours of sweating, digging, and fighting with the winch to finally get it loose. The sound of metal groaning. As it shifted made my stomach twist. I kept praying we weren't doing more damage than had already been done. When it finally lifted out of the mud, the sight of it took my breath away. It was rough, really rough. The body was covered in grime. The paint was practically non-existent, and rust had eaten through parts of the frame. But even in that state, the shape, the curves, it was unmistakable. The Ferrari emblem, though caked in dirt, still shined like it was waiting for someone to find it. Jake stood next to me, wiping sweat from his forehead, staring at it with wide eyes. "So it's real?" It was real. We strapped it down, made sure it wasn't going anywhere, and headed straight to my shop. The drive back felt surreal. I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror at the battered relic on the flatbed, my mind racing with possibilities. If this was a real 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, even in its current state, we could be looking at something worth millions. The idea seemed ridiculous, impossible, but there it was, sitting in the back of my truck like just another junker. Back at the shop, we wasted no time. I grabbed a pressure washer, and Jake got a bucket and some rags. We started scrubbing away the years of neglect, peeling back layers of grime and history. It was like uncovering a buried treasure, piece by piece. The more I cleaned, the more my heart pounded. The lines, the chassis, the small details, it all matched. This wasn't just some old Ferrari. This was the Ferrari. A 250 GTO, one of the rarest, most valuable cars ever built. By the time I was done, I was sitting on the shop floor, covered in grease and sweat, staring at it like I just found the Holy Grail. Jake was next to me, running a hand along the fender. "So what now?" That was the question, wasn't it? We locked up the shop and headed home. I needed to think, to figure out what we were dealing with. But curiosity got the better of me. As soon as we walked through the door, I went straight for my laptop. My wife was in the kitchen, giving us that look she always gave when we brought home trouble. What happened? I told her everything. The car, the history, what it might be worth. Then I started searching. What I found nearly knocked me out of my chair. The Ferrari 250 GTO wasn't just any old race car. It was a race car. Back in the 60s, this thing dominated the competition, winning championship after championship. Only 36 were ever made. And the value? Staggering. In 2018, one had sold for $48 million. Another went for $70 million. My wife leaned over my shoulder, eyes wide. Jake just whistled. That's a lot of money. Understatement of the century. I sat back, rubbing my jaw, trying to wrap my head around what we had just pulled out of the mud. If we played our cards right, this would change everything. Our future, Jake's future. It was all sitting in my shop, waiting for us to make a decision. We spent the next hour talking it over. Selling it as is would still bring in a crazy amount, but restoring it, that could take it to another level. It would be months, maybe years of work. But if we pulled it off, we wouldn't just be making money. We'd be bringing a legend back to life. Jake, who had been silent for most of the conversation, suddenly grinned. "So, do I get to help?" I looked at him, then at my wife. She smirked and shook her head, like you were ever going to say no. She was right. We were doing this. We were about to take on the biggest project of our lives. The next morning, I stood in my shop, staring at the Ferrari like it was some kind of ancient artifact. The car had been sitting in mud for who knows how long, and now it was my job to bring it back to life. The thought was overwhelming, but I knew one thing. I couldn't waste this opportunity. I grabbed my tools and got to work. The first step was stripping the car down completely. Every rusted bolt, every corroded wire, every piece of metal that had been eaten away by time and the elements, it all had to go. I spent days carefully dismantling it, cataloging every part, figuring out what could be salvaged and what was beyond saving. By the end of the first week, the Ferrari was nothing more than a skeleton, its parts laid out on every available surface in my shop. The body panels, the frame, the engine, everything needed work. A lot of work. I started diving deep into forums, searching for any information I could find on restoring a 250 GTO. Turns out, there aren't a lot of people in the world who have done this kind of work, and those who have, they weren't exactly handing out free advice. Most of what I found were collectors discussing their million-dollar purchases, but every now and then, I'd stumble onto an old mechanics post from years ago, sharing details on how these cars were originally built. Parts were another nightmare. This wasn't the kind of car you could just walk into an auto parts store and buy replacements for. Everything was rare, expensive, and often hidden away in private collections. I spent hours calling around, tracking down whatever I could find. Some pieces I had to get custom fabricated, and that wasn't cheap. Speaking of money, that was disappearing fast. The little savings I had, gone. The cash I had set aside for emergencies, burned through in weeks. I knew restoring this car wouldn't be cheap, but I hadn't realized just how quickly the cost would spiral out of control. I sat at the kitchen table one night, staring at a pile of invoices, knowing I had two choices: give up or go all in. I went all in. The next morning, I walked into the bank and took out a $100,000 loan. The guy handling my application nearly choked when I told him what it was for. "You're telling me you found a Ferrari in the woods?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, "And I'm bringing it back." He just shook his head and processed the paperwork. With the new funds, I finally had the resources to push forward. Over the next few months, the shop became a second home. Actually, more like my only home. I spent every waking hour working on the car. My hands were constantly covered in grease. My back ached from leaning over the chassis, and my brain felt like it was running on fumes most days. The hardest part? The engine. That V12 had been sitting in a swamp for decades, and it showed. Rust had eaten away at key components, and some parts were so corroded that even touching them felt like they might crumble. Finding replacements was nearly impossible. The only way to get certain pieces was through private collectors, and let me tell you, those guys didn't let go of their treasures easily. I was up late most nights, combing through obscure websites, emailing people who barely spoke English, negotiating with guys who knew they had me over a barrel. Every purchase felt like a small victory, but also a gut punch when I saw the price tags. Through all of it, my wife and Jake kept me going. She made sure I ate, even when I was too exhausted to think about food. Some nights she'd come out to the shop with coffee, sit with me in silence while I worked, like she knew I just needed someone there. And Jake? That kid was my shadow. He couldn't do the heavy lifting, but he helped in every way he could, scrubbing down parts, polishing metal, handing me tools before I even asked for them. I'd catch him running his hands over the bodywork sometimes, like he couldn't believe what we were building together. One night, after a particularly frustrating day trying to get the suspension to align properly, Jake sat on the floor next to me, picking at a grease stain on his jeans. "Hey," he said, nudging my shoulder. "When this thing is done, can I be the first one to ride in it?" I looked at him, exhausted but smiling. "You kidding me? You're going to be the co-pilot." That seemed to settle something in him. He grinned and went back to scrubbing an old boat clean, like it was the most important job in the world. After 4 months of grinding, the Ferrari was starting to look like a car again. The frame had been restored, the body panels were back in place, and for the first time in decades, it was beginning to resemble the legend it once was. We still had a long way to go, but standing there in my shop, covered in grease, staring at what we had accomplished so far, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. 6 months. That's how long it took. 6 months of sweat, busted knuckles, sleepless nights, and more coffee than any human should drink. But standing in my shop, staring at the Ferrari 250 GTO, gleaming under the overhead lights, I knew it had all been worth it. The engine purred like a tiger, low, controlled, powerful. Every inch of the car had been brought back to perfection, from the hand-stitched leather seats to the deep, glossy red paint. It looked like it had just rolled off the factory floor in 1962. I ran my hand over the hood, still not quite believing what we had done. Jake stood next to me, arms crossed, grinning like he was the one who built it. "So do we keep it?" I laughed. "Kid, unless you got $50 million lying around, this one's got to go." That was the next step, finding the right buyer. A car like this wasn't something you threw on Craigslist. It needed a stage, an audience that understood what it was worth. After some calls and emails, I got in touch with one of the biggest auction houses in the country. When they heard what I had, they didn't hesitate. They wanted it in their next high-profile event. 3 days. That's how long we had before the auction. my wife, Jake, and I packed up and flew out to the city where it was being held. It felt surreal, walking into the auction house's headquarters, seeing our Ferrari sitting there under bright spotlights like some kind of museum piece. People were already buzzing about it. Wealthy collectors, car enthusiasts, journalists, everyone wanted a look. The night of the auction, my nerves were shot. I had spent half a year pouring everything I had into this car. Now, it all came down to a few minutes of bidding. The auctioneer started the bid at $10 million. Within seconds, it jumped to $20 million. Then $30 million. The numbers kept climbing. Jake was gripping my wife's hand so hard, I thought he might cut off her circulation. Then, the big moment. Two collectors went head-to-head, pushing the price higher and higher. $50 million. $55 million. And finally, the hammer dropped at $58 million. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. My wife was in tears. Jake was jumping up and down. We had done it. We had turned an abandoned wreck into one of the most valuable cars ever sold. Of course, there were fees. The auction house took their cut. Taxes had to be paid. But when it was all said and done, $44 million landed in our account. More money than I had ever imagined having in my life. A year later, everything was different. We bought a house near the ocean, a beautiful place with enough space for all of us to finally breathe. I finally made my dream a reality. I opened the biggest auto restoration shop in the area. Not just a regular repair shop, but a place where classic cars got a second life. I hired a full team, the best mechanics I could find, and we built something incredible. Jake thrived. We enrolled him in a top private school, where he finally had the chance to learn and grow without worrying about anything else. He still spent weekends in the shop with me, hands deep in engine grease, always asking a million questions. Life was good. No, life was great. One afternoon, we were sitting on the back porch, watching the waves crash in the distance. Jake had just finished telling me about some history project he was working on when my wife came outside, looking nervous but excited. She took a deep breath and said the words I never expected to hear. "I'm pregnant." I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, to say she was joking. Doctors had told us years ago that it wasn't possible, but the look on her face told me everything. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh, so I did both. We hugged, and Jake ran into the room, demanding to know what was going on. When we told him, he went quiet for a second, then asked a question that broke my heart a little. "When the baby comes, are you going to love me less?" My wife knelt down, taking his hands in hers. "Never. We will always love you, no matter what. You were our son first, and nothing will ever change that." I ruffled his hair and told him, "Besides, someone's got to teach the kid how to fix cars. That's your job now." He grinned. "Yeah, I guess I could do that." Later that night, I stood in the garage, looking at the project we had lined up, a '69 Camaro, a classic Porsche, an old Dodge Charger. The place was alive with the sound of tools, the smell of oil and metal. My shop, my dream, and now my future. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was living, and I wouldn't change a thing.